Coming up on Chasing the Natty, for many of you, this is the final week of the CFF regular season, and we are here to help you nail down your playoff spots and get you prepared for those oh-so-important weeks afterwards. We'll tackle some disappointing performers from the past couple of weeks. We'll talk about some big Week 10 performers that you should probably avoid on the waiver wire, and then we'll cover the players you could be adding to your roster that'll be crucial as you take your shots at your own personal CFF natties. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
Look at GT go, breaks the tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton past the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton!
Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milrow! Goodbye! Touchdown, Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in, everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday morning during the season at 6 a.m. sharp. You can also find us on Wednesday morning as well. You can, if you want to support the great work we're doing here, head on over to campusofcanton.com. Subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We got content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether it's CFF, Devy, C2C, College IDP, College DFS. Really, if you play it, then we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me in the show on Twitter. I'm at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty. And if you have not already, show us some love by leaving a like, a comment, and subscribe. If you're on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you leave a 5-star review. Make sure you're following the show. That not only shows us support, but it also gives the game of college fantasy football in general a ton of support. So please, we do a lot of hard work over here, bringing you guys some awesome content, so show us a little bit of love by doing those little things. So y'all, here we are, week 10. I guess it really blows my mind that, I don't know, there's like always a little bit of a drag in the middle of the season where I'm like, oh wow, I can't believe we're already 6 weeks in, but man, I can't believe we still got like 4 weeks to go before we even get to playoffs. And then now all of a sudden I'm here, I'm like, I was thinking about it this morning. I was getting ready for the CFF List waiver draft show, which, by the way, you should go check out their stuff. CFF List, their YouTube show. We did a little weekly mock draft, picking up waiver players for this week. But anyway, I was getting ready for that show, and it was dawning on me. I'm like, holy crap, we got 1 week left in a ton of my leagues where, you know, if you're in a league with, you know, 6 or more teams in the playoff, like, this is it. This is the final week. Like, you gotta, you know, strap up, get ready. Like, some of y'all might maybe already have your spots locked in, but this is what I kind of realized. This is not what I meant to open the show with, but like, I was kind of thinking about league formats today, and I was kind of thinking about like some of these bigger leagues and like how many teams you should have in your playoff positions. And I am kind of, as I've played for more and more years, I am kind of getting to the point where 6 teams in a playoff is, I think, the optimal number of teams to have in most formats. When you have 12 teams in your league, I think it's a little bit wishy-washy, because I don't know. I don't like the idea of giving away too many playoff spots, because, you know, you like only the teams that make it that far to, or only a select few teams to kind of make it into the playoffs. You don't want to give away half your league a shot at the championship. But also at the same time, like, when you have 6 teams and you have that first round bye, that really does go to help a lot when it comes to there still being something to fight for if you're still at the top there. Like, for example, right, I am in both the FSGA CFF League and the Kings Classic. I'm currently in really good positions in both of those leagues, to basically the point where I've already locked in my spot in the playoff for both of those leagues. But there's still a shot that I miss on a bye week this week, and I'm realizing like, oh shoot, like I got something serious to play for this weekend. Like if that didn't exist, right, and like maybe it was like 8 teams or something like that, right, where no matter what I was playing the next week already, like I wouldn't pay nearly as much attention in that league this week. So just a little food for thought. That's just kind of me rambling to start the show, but that's kind of where we're at. Again, we're only a few, like either this is your last regular season week or you got another week after this. Regardless, like it's showtime. You gotta get your guys up and ready to go, and we've got some players here to discuss for you guys. We got a full show today. Nate obviously last week was focusing mostly on the waiver picks. First of all, real quick, shout out to Nate for taking over for me last week. If for those of you who maybe didn't catch my thanks on the sit start show from this past week with me and Justin Leo, shout out to Nate for taking over that show. He did a fantastic job. Really appreciate him stepping in like that. He did a great job covering the waiver players last week. I'll let you guys know right now, I didn't fully get a list of all the players he talked about, so there's a decent chance I probably maybe hit on 1 or 2 players that he talked about last week, but I tried my best to remember the ones he did touch on when I go into it. But regardless, like I said, we got a full show here. We're bringing back the Freakout list. We got 3 players that people wanted me to discuss here today. Probably the first time this season that we're going to truly have 3 players that are true in-season performers, and we're judging whether or not their recent stretch of bad games is worth worrying about or not. So that'll be fun to take a look at. Obviously, we have our waiver wire traps. We'll touch through 5 different players. Most of them are pretty obvious. There are 2 names on there, though, that I need people to be very, very careful of. I know they had really big performances this past week. I know they look like they're in pretty optimal CFF positions or spots in systems that we like, but we need to take a chill pill on those guys. And then we got a full list of waiver wire pickups for you guys today. Lots of different guys. A good mix of guys that are going to help you this week, but also in the playoffs as well. Some guys that are already on bye this week, but then have 3 awesome matchups after this point for the playoffs. So we'll get all into that here in just a minute. But first, before we get there, let me just take a quick sip of water, and then we'll get on over to the Freakout list. So, all right. We are hydrating, so we do not dehydrating. That didn't make any sense. What am I even saying? Let's stop being clever, Jared. Let's just move on over to our Freakout Scale. So like I mentioned before, we got 3 names that we're going to be discussing here today. And the first 2 are 2 quarterbacks that have been really, really solid for CFF for the most part throughout this season, right? But recently, both of these guys have hit pretty big slides, and I got a lot of people asking me, like, is this something we should worry about? Were they only first half performers and this slide is for real? Are they going to bounce back? The 2 quarterbacks we're going to be discussing here are one Eli Holstein, quarterback out of Pittsburgh, and then Kyle McCord, quarterback out of Syracuse. We'll start with Holstein. And for those of you who need a quick reminder, again, myself, Chris K, and Nate Marquise all give a score on 1 to 10, 10 being, drop that fool, no reason for him to be on your roster. 1 is start with confidence. Chris K is at a 3, I'm at a 5, Nate is at a 6. So just kind of give you a general idea of on that 1 to 10 scale, where we are at. Holstein's an interesting one to kind of follow because he was doing phenomenal, right? Like the fact that he's only just now averaging below 29 fantasy points per game given this recent stretch should tell you a lot about just how dominant he was to about the halfway point in the season, right until about week 7. He was at QB 9 in CFF when it comes to fantasy points per game, right? But since then, he has put up a game of 5.42 fantasy points against Cal, 14 points versus Syracuse, and then 13 points this past week against SMU. Just been on a massive, massive slide over the last couple of weeks, and there's been some varying reasons for it, right? Cal and SMU were legitimately tough defensive matchups there. Now, obviously, you would have liked to have seen more than that, but, things happen. And then Syracuse, if for those of you that even, watch that game, that it was a weird game. Like 3 defensive touchdowns from Pittsburgh with Kyle McCord handing out turnovers like it's a bakery. Holstein only had to attempt 15 passes in that game, finished the game with 108 yards, 2 touchdowns. The fact he got 2 touchdowns in that was a minor miracle in and of itself. The other thing that's really kind of stood out to me with Holstein over the last 3 weeks is that his rushing production just is not there like it was the first half of the season, right? Like 1 rushing yard versus Cal, 20 rushing yards versus Syracuse, 19 rushing yards versus SMU. And the crazy thing is that, like, we're not even like looking at like high sack yardage here, right? He had 15 sack yards versus Cal, 16 versus SMU. So even if you put those yards back into his rushing total, right, you're looking at a high of 35 yards, and he was getting much higher than that in the weeks before that. But if you look at his last 3 games, again, like I mentioned, Cal, SMU, legitimately tough defenses to face. I like no doubt about that. I even had Holstein as one of my sits on my start-sit show this past week. So this past week's performance was not surprising to me really at all. But that leaves the question of what do we do with him moving forward, right? His next 3 games, he's done with byes, so he only has 4 games left here. You get Virginia, you get Clemson, you get Louisville. On paper, you love this Virginia matchup coming up this week. You love the idea of a potential bounce back, right? Virginia, according to our numbers, has C2C winning edge, 125th in the country in team performance defending the pass, right? So bottom 10 team in the country versus the pass there. There's a recipe there for him to have a really good bounce back. The problem is, the one thing I haven't really mentioned here is that Holstein is playing hurt. That was a major factor in the game for Pittsburgh this past week against SMU, that and them giving up nearly half 100 points. But even still, like, Holstein was not in a place where he could actively take over that game and try to get them to turn it around for them, right? So if Holstein's still hurt in this game against Virginia, I'm not saying that he can't perform well, but you're definitely not feeling as great about it. And you think to yourself, like, well, if he played last week and he plays this week, you would think if he's playing, that means he's relatively close, right? I don't necessarily fully disagree with that. But let's say he's still limited against Virginia. What does he got after that? Clemson, Louisville. Things get a little bit tougher all of a sudden, right? Clemson, they're 49th in the country versus the pass. Louisville 73rd, so there's some room for Holstein to do well there. But both Clemson and Louisville are pretty good against the run. Clemson 64th, so right in the middle, right about average. And then Louisville is 38th. You are looking for, or you're not really seeing any exploitable matchups there within those last 2 games. And so that definitely worries me with Holstein. I don't think we're getting over the next 3 games, I don't think we're getting back what we had to start the season. Do I think that we can get Holstein, who is back to averaging, 20 to 24 points per game, rather than this skid of sub 15 point performances we've had over the last 3 weeks? Yes, I can see that. That's why I got him as a 5, because I don't see how he continues to have such poor performances here. But in terms of getting back what we had to start the season, I don't think that's coming back. Kyle McCord, I got him at a 6. Nate and Chris are higher at 8, and I don't blame them. Kyle McCord's already one of those quarterbacks in CFF, right? Because he's a statue quarterback, because he's not going to rush or anything like that. You kind of give him a little bit of a shorter leash, right? If he's not giving you the passing numbers that you need from him, there's very little reason for him to have him on your roster. But that's kind of where I'm a little bit okay with him, right? Because I got him at a 6. If you look at his passing yardage, 346 versus NC State, 321 versus Pitt, 280 versus Virginia Tech. He hasn't really had, yardage-wise, a terrible performance. The big problem with McCord over the last couple of weeks has been the scoring opportunities. Part of what made McCord incredible to start the season was you could basically load him in and expect basically 4 touchdowns from him just every single week. He's lost that. That's just not happening anymore. He has scored 2 or less touchdowns in each of his last 3 games. And quite frankly, this offense just isn't looking nearly as good to start the season. As the season's gone along, ACC defenses have started to figure him out a little bit. I mean, shoot, Pitt had his freaking number. 5 interceptions in that game. 3 of them went for pick sixes. So how does this relate to what can we expect out of him moving forward, right? Obviously, he's, again, despite everything, like, McCord isn't like completely bottoming out here, right? 20 points versus NC State, 15 versus Pitt, 18 versus Virginia Tech. Now, that you don't love that at all. Like, that's not really if that's what you can expect the rest of the season. He's not a startable quarterback in CFF, right? But can he bounce back? Let's take a look at his upcoming schedule. He's got at Boston College, at Cal, versus UConn. Those are his next 3 games. All 3 are relatively tough, right? In terms of defensive performance, right? You got Boston College, who's 78th versus the pass. There's something to be had there. Cal's 39th, but we've seen, that secondary be tested. I mean, shoot, Miami had their way with it. And then UConn, right? They're 32nd against the pass, according to our numbers of C2C winning edge. But, there's a talent discrepancy between, the likes of Syracuse versus UConn. At least you would hope there would be, right? At least or at the very least, it is a talent discrepancy that you would hope that Syracuse would be able to exploit, right? But Kyle McCord should be able to throw up 4 touchdowns versus UConn here, right? So between those 3 games, I could see McCord getting back on track in at least 2 of them. So that's personally why I'm a bit more okay with it than Nate or Chris. Both of those guys are pushing the idea that McCord's been found out. We're not getting back to where we were before. And I personally agree. It's just a matter of, can he get back to, very similar to Holstein, can he get back to 25 points per game rather than, living in 30 plus fantasy points per game like he was at the start of the season? Don't think he is. But again, I'm at a 6. Definitely would be looking for a backup. I'd look at some quarterbacks that are on the waiver wire and check to see what options are available there. And definitely wouldn't be loving the idea of starting him against Boston College this weekend. So the third player we need to check out on the waiver or on the freakout scale for this week is a wide receiver, and we need to talk about Mr. Pofele Ashlock, wide receiver out of Hawaii. Ashlock's kind of weird, right? Because on one hand, you feel like you should be disappointed by him, because when you look at his position among all wide receivers total on the season, right, he's been hovering around like wide receiver 45 to like, I think he's at wide receiver 90 now after his last couple of performances. And you're sitting there thinking like, okay, like he hasn't been great all year, Jared. Like, why is he on this freakout scale? Well, in total points, he hasn't been ranked very highly. I didn't realize this though, but he in fantasy points per game, at week 6, Ashlock was as high as wide receiver 14 on the season. He was doing what we expected him to do coming into the season. I mean, shoot, his last 2 games or 2 of his last games before he kind of got hurt here against Northern Iowa, he had 13 targets there. San Diego State University had 17 targets in that game, right? He was doing exactly what we were expecting him to do. Problem is that he's taken quite a bit of a dip here in recent weeks, right? Against Boise State, 4 targets, 3 catches, 42 yards. Very much expect that, I suspect that he got hurt in that game, right? Then he misses the next game, comes back versus Nevada, 6 targets, 3 catches, 21 yards. And then the next week against Fresno State, 6 targets, 3 catches, 30 yards, 1 touchdown. Huge hit in targets over the last 3 weeks. He had more targets versus San Diego State University on October 5th than he has gotten in his last 3 games combined. Ashlock, as far as I can tell, is playing hurt. And I think on top of that, defenses know really what to expect from him now. He's not somebody that surprises defenses anymore. I think that teams are locking in on Ashlock, kind of daring another wide receiver out of Hawaii to step up. They're trying to get Nicolas Senegal going there, but that's just not working out too well. And so looking forward, right, I'm a little concerned about Ashlock being able to kind of bounce back over the last couple of weeks here. But if you look at his last games of the season here, there is definitely room for some improvement here. And that's why I have him rated the lowest on the Freakout Scale at 6. Chris K's at 7. Nate's at 9, which I think is a little harsh, especially when you look at this upcoming schedule, right? You got the matchup against UNLV this weekend. I don't love it. UNLV's actually been pretty solid against the pass for the most part. Ashlock, if he's still playing hurt, you would expect him to be limited in that game as well. You'd expect teams to be able, or you'd expect the Rebels to be able to lock in on him there. So I don't love him this week. But then his playoff weeks, man, is like the ultimate Jekyll and Hyde here. And what I mean by that is week 12, Utah State, literally one of the worst defenses in the country, which is awesome. And then you get a bye, and you're like, well, shoot, now he's a 0 that week. That sucks. And then he comes back against New Mexico. New Mexico's literally probably the worst defense in the country. And so you get these awesome matchups in week 12 and week 14, awesome playoff matchups. You get a bye in between, but that was always kind of baked into Ashlock's cost, right? That they had 3 byes this year. Sucks, but whatever. To me, yes, grab another wide receiver. Hopefully, if the problem with, I'm trying to figure out how the best way to say this, because the problem is we're not going to really know how much to freak out about Ashlock until it's probably too late. Because UNLV, I expect him not to do very well in this game against UNLV. Utah State the next week, if he doesn't perform there, it's a 5-alarm fire. Problem is that he only has 1 game after that. And so you're just sitting there like, all right, well, I just don't start him for 1 game. And in which case, like, that's a playoff week there next week. And so you're probably already out of it if Ashlock bottoms out against Utah State. So it's a little hard, but personally, I'm at a 6. But man, if you're an Ashlock manager, it's not a fun place to be right now. So, all right, that's enough rambling from me on some of the guys that have been underperforming. Let's go take a look at the waiver wire, but in a negative light, let's take a look at some of the players that are looking mighty tasty on that waiver wire with some really nice performances this past week, but I'm telling you guys, don't go after them. So the first one here, I'd say is a pretty easy one. Ben Finley, the quarterback out of Akron. Not only has Akron kind of been shuffling around quarterbacks for a bit here, but Ben Finley is, I guess, how else am I going to say this? It's an Akron quarterback. Akron's a bad team. Akron cannot be trusted to perform extremely well and put up points versus teams that they're supposed to. Sometimes they surprise you and do so against teams they're not supposed to, but Akron players are not really something that I've ever really grown to enjoy. Like, I know some people have talked about Adrian Norton, the wide receiver there, as a potential waiver ad, and I'm just not comfortable like betting on the Zips in terms of CFF assets because there's just so much that goes on here, right? And then and then with Finley, right, this past week, he throws for 4 touchdowns. And to give you, like, he's had 2 touchdowns in the previous 4 games combined, right? That's just not something you love to do. You know, Joe Moorhead loves to run the ball. If he's going to score touchdowns, you're probably going to see a running back get it, maybe even a fullback thrown in there if they want to get spicy with it. Long story short, don't trust an Akron quarterback. Javante Barnes, running back out of Oklahoma, is going to be one that I think is going to not make people mad per se, but I have my reasons for not going here. And basically that reason boils down to that Oklahoma's offense sucks, right? Don't let what Oklahoma is able to do against a ridiculously terrible Maine team, even by FCS standards, cloud your judgment on what they're going to be moving forward. They're going to go right back into SEC play. They're going to go right back to struggling. And while Javante Barnes, like, again, he gets volume here, right? 18 carries, 14 carries, 17 carries, 16 carries. Like, it's not like he's in a full-blown committee situation there with the Sooners. He's obviously the main back there right now. Problem is, again, he's averaging less than 5 yards per carry in conference play. He scored 1 touchdown in his previous 4 games before this game against Maine. And of course, in the game against Maine, 203 yards, 3 touchdowns. It's just a classic example of playing lower competition, benefiting from it. And then people are going to get tricked into believing Oklahoma has got themselves their new lead back here. We're going to ride on this guy. Maybe he does well. I'm not saying I'm not rooting for Javante Barnes or this Oklahoma offense to get better as the weeks progress here towards the end of the season. But right now, I'm not trusting this. Absolutely not. And I bet you ask any Oklahoma fan, I'm telling you, right now, they wouldn't trust it either. Next player to avoid on the waiver wire, another waiver wire trap here, is probably our number 1 player from this past weekend, and that is Jordan Watkins, wide receiver out of Ole Miss. And again, if you guys have listened to me long enough, you know there's plenty here for me to point out as to why you shouldn't be over the moon about this performance, right? Obviously, incredible performance from Watkins. If you were lucky to have him on a best ball team, if you were lucky to have him just in your starting lineup because there were just so many dadgum bye weeks last week, awesome. Glad it worked out for you. But this past week, 9 targets, 8 catches, 254 yards, and 5 touchdowns. As you can see, 5 touchdowns on 8 catches obviously is not sustainable. But even if he's not putting in this monster performance, right, we're not going to expect 31 yards per catch here, right? Ole Miss was down both Trey Harris and Antwain Wells, right? Basically leaving Watkins as the only legitimate option. They're going up against Arkansas, a team that, if Ole Miss is clicking on all cylinders, can absolutely destroy, which is what they did this past week. You know, Lane's not afraid to run it up. If they found a mismatch with Watkins versus one of the Arkansas defenders there, they took advantage of it over and over and over again, obviously, as we can see here. But like I said, there's just plenty of flags here to tell me that, you know, he didn't score a touchdown in each of his last 3 games. He's had 8 or less targets in the previous games, but he's never broken 100 yards in any of those games. Again, he's typically a slot guy for this Ole Miss offense. I'd have to go look to see if he switched to the outside for this game because of just how beaten up they are at all the other positions. But regardless, like, just look at Watkins' history and you can tell that this is not sustainable whatsoever. And I'm not even asking for, 60-point performances every week. I'm just talking about before this, he hadn't hit double digits in half PPR formats in the last 3 weeks. So I'd avoid Jordan Watkins for the most part. They should be getting back Trey Harris this week. They should be getting back Antwain Wells here relatively soon, and Watkins will quickly move back to second or third option on this offense. So Latrell Caples, wide receiver out of Boise State, is another player that we need to avoid on the waiver wire this week. I know a lot of people love this Boise team. I know a lot of people are rooting for them to make the playoff. I know a lot of people are, like moi, are rooting for Ashton Jeanty to win the Heisman. And we know this is an offense that can score. We know this is an offense that can really outclass a lot of teams there in the Mountain West and really put up some points. So it's natural for us to start looking around for some receiving options from the Broncos here, especially if teams are going to focus in on Ashton Jeanty, as we saw this past week against San Diego State. It's going to leave a lot of these receivers wide open. And Caples was absolutely that guy this past week. 6 catches, 90 yards, 3 touchdowns. Problem is, as much as I love Caples, and I have had my eye on him for a couple of years now, he's just not a guy that is really treated as a funneling point for this offense. Maybe that changes as the week goes on here, but like we're basing, if you're if you're grabbing him off the waiver wire because of this one performance, but ignoring the fact that he had 2 or less targets in each of the 3 games before that point, I think you're asking for a world of trouble there. Now, we'll see. Again, Boise State's got some good matchups upcoming here. We'll see if Caples sticks this. Maybe I'm wrong here in a couple of weeks, and he'll be on my waiver wire ads here as we get into the playoffs. But for right now, I'm not trusting Latrell Caples. Last but not least, I kind of touched on him earlier a little bit when I talked about Pefele Ashlock, but Nicholas Senecal, the wide receiver out of Hawaii, I mentioned with the way that teams were defending Hawaii, they were very much locking in on Ashlock and daring another wide receiver to beat them. Well, unfortunately for Fresno State, who ended up losing this game, Senecal answered the call. 16 targets, 12 catches, 113 yards, and 2 touchdowns there. the issue here is that if you look at his previous games, right? In his previous 3 games, we saw 10 targets versus Boise, 7 catches, 59 yards. We saw against Washington State 7 targets, against Nevada 4 targets. We're all over the place. There's no consistent volume here for Senegal. Maybe it's dependent on Ashlock. Maybe it's dependent on how well teams are able to cover Ashlock, and that leaves Senegal open. Who knows? But for right now, there's not really a discernible pattern with Senegal. I think that if you're grabbing him off the waiver wire and starting him, you're going with a waiver. You're going with a flyer at best here. And don't get me wrong, Hawaii's got some decent matchups here as we head towards the end of the season. But for right now, I say decent. Again, we're talking about Utah State and New Mexico. So awesome matchups here towards the end of the season. So maybe you grab him for there. But I think that you're running the risk of hitting yourself with a single digit performance out of Senegal in any of those games, just because there's not much of a discernible pattern. So those are my waiver wire traps for the week against Ben Finley, quarterback out of Akron, Javante Barnes, running back out of Oklahoma, Jordan Watkins, wide receiver out of Ole Miss, Latrell Caples, wide receiver out of Boise State, and then Nicholas Senegal, wide receiver out of Hawaii. Those are my waiver wire traps. I would avoid grabbing them off the waiver wire this week. So, with all that being said, a sip of water, and then we'll be on our way to the actual quarterbacks you should be picking up for this week. So I touched on this when I was on the CFF Lists waiver draft show. When we started off the show, and the first name that came off the board was a quarterback. And it made all the sense in the world that Parker Navaro would be the first quarterback off the board this week, because if you've listened to my show the past couple of weeks, the quarterback position has been stocked, right? I was listing the same names every single week. We've had plenty of times to really grab the consistent names that have emerged as the season's gone along here. As we get towards the end of the season, outside of injury, the names are mostly gone. There's very few guys that are going to provide you consistent names on the board. Probably the one guy left, I would say, is a consistent play from here on out is Parker Navaro, quarterback out of Ohio. And his matchup, especially this week, is extra juicy. He's going up against Kent State, who is near the bottom in almost all defensive metrics. Again, in our team defensive performance metric over at C2C Winning Edge, Kent State is bottom 2 in the country. And quite frankly, they're a team that's mostly given up on the season. They ticked me off so much against Western Michigan. They got down, and rather than trying to fight back, with your 2 stud wide receivers and Christian McCray and Luke Floria and Ulatowski. Now, granted, Ulatowski was throwing picks like you wouldn't believe, but even still, they just started running the ball. They just wanted to get out of there. They're a team that just wants this season to end already, which is such a shame. Regardless, Ohio should be able to have their way with them. Navaro, dual threat quarterback. You're talking about a guy that has 80-plus yards on the ground in 3 of his last 4 games. Again, the passing always leaves a little bit to be desired, but this is more than good enough of a matchup for Navaro to hit 25 to 30 points pretty easily. Even after this, you get Eastern Michigan the week after. They're pretty susceptible. Their defense is 108th in the country when it comes to team defensive performance. You get Toledo the week after that. They're definitely a little bit tougher. I wouldn't love that matchup, but if you're just looking for a quarterback that could help you get into the playoffs and really get you a hot start in the playoffs, I think Navaro is absolutely your guy. So yeah, Navaro, again, I think is the clearest grab at quarterback for this week. If you're a team that is struggling with maybe some buys here late, or you waited way too long to grab some of the quarterbacks that were available, I think Navaro is probably your last chance. But that doesn't mean there's other quarterbacks that we can't consider here, and one being Mr. Kaden Hauser, quarterback out of East Carolina, rostered on 8% of rosters. Not this past week, he's actually on bye this past week, but last time we saw him against Temple, 29 passing attempts, 16 completions, 269 yards, 5 touchdowns. Dude is an absolute monster. Also had a yard on the ground. I don't know why East Carolina apparently waited so long to make this switch, because this offense looks incredible with Hauser under center. Now, granted, part of it had to deal with the head coach getting fired, I have to assume, but Hauser's looked fantastic. Again, in his 2 starts so far, he's had 269 plus yards in each of them. He's had 8 touchdowns through the air in the last 2 games, 9 total through the last 2 games, right? Granted, he played against Temple, which isn't like the hardest defensive matchup to go up against, but I was actually really impressed in his first start. Like, despite the fact that he lost, like throwing 3 touchdowns and almost 300 yards against that Army defense, that is a very, very legit accomplishment for Hauser to do there in his first start. So I think he's legit. The upcoming schedule is fantastic. You get Florida A&M or Florida Atlantic this upcoming weekend. They're a little stingy versus the past, but again, they're a defense that can be had, right? Then you get Tulsa the week afterwards. They're 122nd in the country in team defensive performance against the pass. And then after that, oh my God, in week 13, in the middle of your playoffs, Kaden Hauser is going up against North Texas. I swear to God, dude, y'all, like, Hauser and Morris might combine for almost 800 yards passing in that game. That might be one of the best shootouts we see towards the end of the year if Hauser's able to keep up this performance here. Because North Texas's passing defense is horrific. They're bottom 3 in the country. So, again, I'd like to see a little bit more out of Hauser before I'm like really, really excited to start him. But if he can get through this Florida Atlantic game this upcoming weekend with a really solid passing stat, Tulsa and North Texas being on deck right there in the middle of playoffs is oh so perfect. So another guy that if you're struggling with at quarterback and you're heading into the playoffs, you don't really have a plan at quarterback, I think Hauser's absolutely a guy you have to be considering. Just know that, again, his rushing is not much to be desired, although he can run around the goal line. So, hopefully he falls into the end zone once or twice. Next quarterback here, I'm going to throw a little warning on here. I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself on this one, but I like what I've seen out of Kaden Hauser. Like, good Lord. Not Kaden Hauser, Kaden Anderson, the quarterback out of Wyoming. We have not seen a ton out of Anderson so far this year. We've seen a ton out of Savoba, but Savoba is, shall we say, pretty clearly not it for this Wyoming offense. And ever since Anderson's kind of come in, this Hawaii offense seems to be able to run just a little bit more efficiently, right? Anderson saw about half the action in the game against Utah State, 24 passing attempts, 182 yards, no touchdowns for him there. So he had a pretty abysmal fantasy day, but the bones were still good there, right? 7.6 yards per attempt. Then he goes up against New Mexico the following week, 29 passing attempts, 342 yards, 3 touchdowns through the air. He also added a touchdown on the ground. He had negative yardage, but it's pretty clear that Anderson is a guy that can run as well. Maybe not as much as Savoba, but there's a possibility of him running it around the goal line. So Anderson, the offense just looks like it's running better under Anderson. The upcoming schedule here is really nice. You get Colorado State, then you get Boise State, 2 teams outside the top 80 in passing defensive team performance here. So you love to see that. Obviously, the bye this upcoming week is a little troublesome. We would like to probably see another game out of Anderson before we really start wanting to trust him in the playoffs. But again, just based on eye test, just based on how this offense is like scoring, you love to see it. But it's also definitely worth noting that, again, both New Mexico and Utah State, as I talked about with the Hawaii players earlier, you're talking about 2 of the worst defenses in the entire country. So there's a good chance that they just make Anderson look good because they just are absolutely terrible. So I guess if you're really, really struggling at quarterback, go with Anderson. But for the most part, maybe put him on a watch list instead. One guy, though, that I am a bit more excited about now that I am moving forward further along with him is Mr. Dylan Risk, the quarterback out of UCF, rostered on 1% of leagues this past week against Arizona. 25 passing attempts, 20 completions, 294 yards, 3 touchdowns. He also had 9 rushing attempts for 55 yards and no touchdowns on the ground. Yes, this is the second, or I guess if you want to count KJ Jefferson in the preseason, this is the third. This is indeed the third Gus Malzahn quarterback that we are recommending on this show this year. It is not my fault that Gus cannot seem to make up his mind, but I do think that we're probably looking at the guy of the future here with Dylan Risk, at least maybe until the end of the season. We'll see kind of what happens after this point, but between Jefferson and Ja'Cory Brown, that UCF team just could not pass the ball. Just straight up, right? Jefferson's washed. Ja'Cory Brown's just an atrocious passer. We gave him a couple of weeks there, and it felt like he was just kind of getting worse and worse every week. The defense has kind of figured out that, you don't need much to stop him on that front. So Gus has made the decision that Risk is coming in, and he would kind of provide a spark to this offense because of all of their options at quarterback. The talk was that he was the most stable passer of the bunch, and that's what we're seeing play out. Again, he got half the snaps against BYU, came in 10 passing attempts, 102 yards and a touchdown, so over 10 yards per attempt there. He also had 4 carries for 31 yards on the ground. Then I already mentioned this past week, he looked fantastic again, over 11 yards per attempt this past week. People thought he would bring a consistent presence to the passing game, and that's exactly what he has done. Again, 60% completion versus BYU, 80% completion versus Arizona, right? And when he first came in, I was a little concerned that Malzahn's moving to a pocket quarterback. Maybe this is fine, but man, it could really be limited by the fact that he doesn't run the ball. Well, I've been proven wrong over the last couple of weeks. Again, we've seen Risk, 31 yards versus BYU, 55 yards versus Arizona. And that 31 came in a game where he only played about half the snaps. So if you can give me a Gus Malzahn quarterback that maybe isn't a guy that threatens to run for 200 yards, but, if he can lock in 50, 60 rushing yards per game, and then you can give me 10 yards per attempt consistently, I'd feel pretty dang good about that, especially when you look at his upcoming schedule. UCF does have a bye in week 12, so that certainly hurts. But they get Arizona State, they get West Virginia. Those are two teams. West Virginia especially is extremely susceptible versus the pass. They're actually bottom 5 in the country when it comes to defensive passing team performance here. Arizona State, right about the middle of the pack when it comes to that metric, but it is clearly where they are susceptible if there is a weakness on that defense. So I think that Risk has himself the skill set. I think it has the schedule to perform very nicely in 2 of the next 3 weeks. Obviously, you can only get so much out of a bye, but even so, I like Risk. Moving on, the last quarterback that I want to throw out here, it's not a guy that's it's not really a guy that's really exploded recently or anything like that, but Maddox Madson is definitely one to take a look at here. This past week, he threw the ball 32 times, completed 24 of them, 307 yards, 4 touchdowns, also ran the ball 4 times for 25 yards, so he can run, is a dual threat guy. And with so many defenses, focusing in on Ashton Ginty, Madson has been a huge beneficiary of that. With teams stacking the box, with teams hyper focusing on Ginty, Madson's able to keep the ball in some of those read options and rip off some big yardages in those games. We have seen receivers just basically run wide open in the secondary for some of these teams because there's just so many guys are at the box there to stop Ginty, and Madson can basically just kind of pick the poison. I mean, shoot, he had almost 200 yards in the first half of this game against San Diego State here, right? He could have had 500 yards on the day if they just kept throwing the ball in the second half there. He ended the day with 4 touchdowns through the air. I'm not saying that that's going to be something that happens every single week, but if teams like Nevada, teams like San Jose State, if they continue to really kind of lay it on thick versus GNT there. I mean, Madson's just, like I said, he's going to have his way with them, and he'll have probably better performances going forward than he did the previous weeks, because the past 2 weeks, 24 fantasy points versus UNLV, 30 fantasy points versus San Diego State. Before that point, he hadn't had really a good week outside of the game against Portland State. Right? Other than that, he was, sub 22 fantasy points in every single one of those games. I think that Madson, if teams are focusing on GNT, probably creeps his way up into the 25 fantasy points per game to finish the season. Especially, again, he's got a great set of matchups here over the next couple of weeks here. Nevada, San Jose State, Wyoming, all of those teams are teams that Boise State's good enough to really take down and for Madson to exploit. With that being said, let's take a look at some of these honorable mentions. I kept the honorable mentions on the back end here. These are mostly guys we talked about before, but I'll just kind of run through them real quick. Colton Joseph, quarterback out of Old Dominion. He's been basically lighting it up the past couple of weeks. He's on bye this week, but he'll definitely help you in the playoffs there. Owen McCowan, quarterback at UTSA. I don't know what's up with UTSA, but their offense is suddenly clicking over the last couple of weeks, and Owen McCowan's definitely been at the center of that. He's on bye this week, but, another team that has a really good playoff schedule there. Sam Levitt, quarterback out of Arizona State, roster on 28%. He's going up against UCF this week. He's got himself a nice end to the season here. He's been a very safe quarterback for the most part. So if you're somebody who's just looking to kind of lock in, 22 to 24 fantasy points in most of these matchups, I think Levitt's a guy to go with there. Petrus is another one that you could be looking at for that same, or not Petrus, excuse me. Kevin Jennings, the quarterback at SMU, is another one that you could probably kind of lock into that same position there. Unless they try to, hold back all the touchdown opportunities like they did against freaking Pitt this past week. I'm not salty about that at all. And then Spencer Petrus, the quarterback at Utah State, he's got himself a nice matchup against Washington State this week. They're going to be playing from behind in every game they have because their defense is absolute garbage, and they're going to be forced to score. Petrus is going to be right there in the middle of that. He had a disappointing performance versus Hawaii, but I think that was actually one of the rare games where they actually had some level of control in that game. So wasn't really playing from behind. All right. That being said, I'll take a sip here, and then we'll move on to our running backs for this week. All right, let's move into the running backs. And theme of the day with running backs is there's a lot of good options with question marks, which there's nothing clever really about saying that, but at this point in the season, but that's just the honest truth. As I was looking through, I was kind of thinking I don't really love a lot of these running back options. And then I kind of dug a little bit deeper. I'm like, no, actually a lot of these are good, but there's a risk with every single one of them. But we'll start with the first one here. This is probably the one I feel the best about, and that is running back Eli Sanders out of New Mexico here, rostered on 8% of rosters. I think I might have had Sanders as an early waiver watch guy early on the season. I think back in week 0, I think I mentioned him as if his volume continues, then he's going to be a guy we're going to want. And then he kind of fell off a little bit during the season. Mexico was kind of doing a little bit of a hot hand situation. Now, as we get, down the stretch here, as we get closer to playoff weeks here, Sanders is, I don't know if he just has the hot hand every single week, but pretty clear the coaching staff is willing to go with him because 14 carries versus Utah State, 15 carries versus Colorado State, 17 carries versus Wyoming. That doesn't even include the receptions that he's been getting. He's had 5 receptions over the last 2 games here. And he's been pretty consistent in terms of yardage, against 70 plus in 2 of his last 3 games. And then this past week, 205 yards and 2 touchdowns. So clearly Sanders is a huge part of this Lobos offense moving forward, this Bronco Mendenhall offense. I don't typically love running backs in Bronco Mendenhall systems, but here we are, man. Sanders has been just an absolute monster. Given the fact that he just put up a 200-point game or 200-yard game this past week, I highly doubt they're going to move away from him anytime soon. And New Mexico, despite, them having a pretty terrible defense and them having to play from behind all the time, they got some really good matchups over the next couple of weeks here. I mean, obviously it sucks that they have a bye in week 13 right there at the semi-playoffs, but Eli Sanders, man, they go up against San Diego State this weekend. They're 106th in the country in defensive rushing team performance. And then the week afterwards, they go to Washington State coming to town. Obviously, Washington State should be able to put up 50 in that game as well. But Washington State's another team that's pretty susceptible to the run. They're 109th in the country in that same defensive metric there. So, I mean, Sanders, again, he's been pretty solid over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, I'm not expecting any more 200-yard games anytime soon. But you know, he seems to score in pairs, right? In two of his last 3 games, he scored 2+ touchdowns, right? When he scores one, he's likely to score another, especially if you're in a shootout scenario here. I mean, like I said, New Mexico is just a team that is forced to score, and Eli Sanders is clearly the main guy. He's the guy that they rely on near the goal line. I wouldn't be shocked if in these next 2 games, it's a possibility he ends with 4 touchdowns in those 2 games combined. So I like Sanders moving forward. Obviously, like I said, it sucks that he has the bye on week 13, but that's just how the cookie crumbles, unfortunately. The next one I want to throw up here is Mr. Gerald Green, running back out of Troy. This past rostered on 11% or 1%, of leagues. I messed up the graphic. I knew it. I knew I had one typo in there, but rostered on 1% of leagues here. And I don't blame people, because this Troy running back room, we came into the season, we were kind of thinking Damian Taylor. We get into the season, and it's a pretty big committee. Damian Taylor was like RB3 at one point. It was kind of difficult. Like, the guys were shuffling around. And then now, all of a sudden, literally just kind of out of nowhere, I don't know what Troy did during the bye week or anything like that, but these past 2 games, Green's been a workhorse. 20 carries versus Arkansas State, 19 carries versus Coastal Carolina this past weekend, over 113 yards in both those games, a touchdown on the ground in each of those games. He also gets some catches, including an 83-yard catch for a touchdown this past week against Coastal Carolina. I want to trust this. I want to trust this so badly, but knowing that Troy has mostly done a committee before this point, and now all of a sudden we kind of made the switch to Green, I'm praying this is not like a hot hand situation where you just happen to have it hot for 2 weeks in a row. Because if he can hold on to this volume and this efficiency, like again, 5.7 yards per carry versus Arkansas State, 6.5 yards per carry versus Coastal Carolina, if he can hold on to that, he's got a juicy schedule coming up here. Obviously, we got a bye this week, so that sucks. But his last 3 games, his playoff weeks are Georgia Southern, Louisiana, and Southern Miss. All 3 of those teams are 115th or worse in defensive rushing team performance. They are absolute barbecue to a workhorse back. If Green is able to hold on to this, you are set to eat very, very well during the playoffs. It's just a matter of, are you willing to grab Green now, stash him on your bench for a week, and then during your playoff matchup, during that week 12 matchup, are you willing to throw him out there and trust that this volume is legit in that oh so important matchup? That's just kind of the question you have to ask. I think the prime position is if you have a playoff, if you are a league that has playoffs that week, you're just fingers crossed that you're a team that's got a bye and you can kind of just watch and see what happens for 1 week before you decide whether or not you want to rely on him versus Louisiana and Southern Miss, 2 teams that he could absolutely eat against with 20 carries. So we'll see with Green, but like as of right now, Green looks like an absolute monster ad this late in the season if he can keep up that volume. Next running back I want to throw out here is not the guy who's on the screen. Dadgummit, 0 for 2, man. I gotta fire our intern who makes the graphics. But Michael Benfield, the running back out of Kennesaw State, rostered on 6% of leagues. This is a guy that I was kind of looking at before the start of the season. As, you know, not a lot of people are really looking at Kennesaw State, and, you know, I don't blame them considering that, you know, Kennesaw State's really fallen flat on their face his first year in the FCS, or the FBS, excuse me, out of the FCS. But as the season's kind of come along here, right? Obviously, Kennesaw State's definitely had their woes, right? But Michael Benefield's quickly kind of coming back to where he was last year. Last year, he was, 1,000-yard back for the Owls. He started off this year just not that. I don't know if he was hurt. I don't know if he ever got confirmation on that. But lately, his volume's back. 17 carries versus Jacksonville State, 12 carries versus Middle Tennessee, 16 carries versus Liberty, 16 carries versus West Kentucky. He's hit 90-plus yards in 2 of his games. He had a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. With Benefield, you're not looking at a guy that's going to win you the week, right? Shoot, in his last 4 games in half PPR format, his highest fantasy total has been 17.2. But if you just need a plug-and-play guy, a guy that you can rely on to get double-digit performances here against some pretty solid matchups in the next coming weeks, I think Benefield's worth a look here, right? You get the next 3 games for Benefield. By the way, no bye weeks for him the rest of the season here. But you get UTEP, who is 84th versus the run. You get Sam Houston, who's 89th versus the run. And then you get Florida International, who's 103rd versus the run. None of those are, just straight cookies for Benefield to eat. But they're all defenses that, their defenses, their weakness is in the run. And that's probably the one area where Kennesaw State feels pretty comfortable with being able to, perform on a relatively consistent basis, especially if, Davis Bryson can perform well passing the ball like he did against Liberty, kind of find that mojo back a little bit. So Benefield, a guy that, very high floor play. This is not going to be a guy that's going to score you 3 touchdowns most likely in any of these matchups upcoming, but, never say never. Next running back I want to throw out here is Mr. Al-J Henderson, running back out of Buffalo. He's on bye this week, so unfortunately that hurts a little bit, but I wrote this Buffalo offense off, and that was a mistake for the most part. Bad performance against Ohio, obviously only scoring 16 points in that game, but outside of that, 41 points versus Akron, 41 points versus Western Michigan, 30 points versus Toledo. Like, I'll give credit to this Bulls staff here, man. They've got something working here, and Al-J Henderson's been a big part of it. Again, he is just been a production machine over the last couple of weeks. Again, 148 scrimmage yards against Toledo. You're talking about 146 scrimmage yards versus Western Michigan. You're talking about 105 scrimmage yards versus Ohio, and 129 scrimmage yards versus Akron. Like, 4 straight 100-yard games in terms of like his combined production. In his last 3 games, he's had 3+ receptions. So in a PPR format, he's looking really good. The one downside is, as much as Buffalo's kind of scoring some points on offense, Henderson's not quite getting the love, which can mean one of 2 things. One, you could have touchdown regression coming for him, and Henderson could have some really monster games here against the likes of Ball State and Eastern Michigan, 2 teams that absolutely can be had against on the ground. Or, Henderson, between the 20s guy, not a guy that they're really looking to give around the goal line. They have some other guys, like Jaquez Barksdale. I mean, Agbana is a rushing threat, right? He's probably going to get the ball around the goal line quite a bit. Still kind of remains to be seen. But again, to me, there's no denying that if you can just find a running back this late in the season that is pretty consistently getting, 16 plus touches, 16 plus opportunities every single week, and correlating into 100 plus yards against, conference competition here. I mean, you gotta. I think it's worth grabbing Henderson, sticking him on the bench for this week, and then seeing what he can do against Ball State. That Ball State matchup in week 12 might be crucial for people that are trying to make it past that first round of playoffs, especially if you have any critical buys that week. So I like Henderson a lot. Last running back we'll touch on here is George Pettaway, running back out of James Madison, rostered on 23% of leagues here. He's going up against Georgia State this week. Did I get that wrong? George Pettaway, running back out of James Madison, going up against Georgia State this week. Boom, nailed it. We'll forget that I did not nail it the first time if I didn't nail it. I don't know. I need to go back and record it. Or no, go back and listen to it. Enough rambling, Jared. I know you're tired. I know it's late, but you need to focus now. Let's talk about George Pettaway. George Pettaway is obviously now James Madison's clear RB1. Again, obviously Ayoade is a guy that we kind of looked at the beginning of the season. It was talked about by the staff that he'd probably be the main back, as much as there would be a split between all of these guys. But I mean, Adeye's been just straight up garbage this year. There's kind of no denying it. He's old. He's clearly washed. Pettaway, younger guy, really good receiver out of the backfield. And again, he's not getting like super workhorse loads here, but he's gotten 16, 17, 20 opportunities over his last 3 games. You're looking at, games of 98 scrimmage yards. You're looking at 81 scrimmage yards against Georgia Southern. You're looking at 143 scrimmage yards this past week against Southern Miss. It's looking really, really good for Pettaway. Like, he's a clear all-around back for the James Madison. Again, like I said, not a guy that's full workhorse, but we don't really need him to be, especially when 2 of his upcoming matchups here, as we go in, as we prepare for the playoffs and we get into the playoffs, this matchup against Georgia State this weekend is absolutely crucial. Georgia State is 112th in the country in defensive rushing team performance. You get Old Dominion after that, not as good, 42nd in the same metric, but we've seen some teams have their way with Old Dominion on the ground, so I don't think that's completely outside the realm of possibility for it, but I wouldn't trust it as much. But then the week after that, you get App State. They're 124th, so bottom 10 in the country when it comes to defending the run. I think Pettaway is a guy that should continue to earn more workload, especially with Alonzo Barnett being as, shall we say, erratic or inconsistent as he has been. Pettaway's probably been the more consistent piece for this offense the last couple of weeks, and I think the staff is going to quickly realize that. And Pettaway could be an absolute monster in at least 2 of these upcoming 3 weeks, potentially all 3 weeks, if he can just kind of get that volume against Old Dominion. So that being said, let me run through some honorable mention running backs here. One running back that I wanted to mention as an official play was Javon Jackson, my boy out of UTEP, because he was doing nothing. Like it looked really bad. I mean, Jolly, the young, I can't remember if he's a true freshman or redshirt freshman running back there. It looked like he was going to overtake Jackson here, but then Jackson comes back, and now he's kind of quietly had 3 weeks in a row of 20 plus attempts, of 100 plus yards scrimmage wise. And, he, again, clear workhorse back that you can grab in 74% of leagues right now. 2 major problems. One, it's an offense that does not score a lot, right? They scored 10 against Louisiana Tech. They scored 13 versus Middle Tennessee. Those are not tough defenses whatsoever. They do play Kennesaw State this weekend, and I do think that he should be able to do pretty well against the Owls there. But then you get a bye, and then you get Tennessee, which is woof. One, what the hell is Tennessee doing playing UTEP this late in the season? I say that as my dogs prepare to play UMass on that exact same weekend. But regardless, right, like that's just a tough draw for UTEP players right here for CFF purposes, right? Having a bye in the playoff, having Tennessee in the playoffs. That's why I made Jackson not an official play, but he's a pretty solid pickup for this week at the very least. Bryson Washington, the running back at Baylor, is another guy I have my eye on right now. He's on bye this week. He is a true freshman, and he has been slowly kind of building up his workload over the last couple of weeks. Again, 10 carries versus Texas Tech for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns. 17 carries for 78 yards versus Oklahoma State. And this past week was the monster game. 96 yards, 4 touchdowns on 26 attempts. Also caught 2 balls for 22 yards. Just monster day from Washington there. I don't really know what to expect from him because we've seen this song and dance feels like 3 years in a row with Baylor, with, young freshman running back coming in, taking over for a bit, only to kind of fizzle out relatively quickly. So that's, again, why I'm not making him an official play. But he's got some decent matchups. You got at West Virginia, you got at Houston. Again, he's on bye this week, but we'll kind of see how it goes in those games right there. I am a little queasy. I'm not ready to make him an official play, but if you're struggling at running back and you're in a deeper league, maybe take a shot on him. Mari Daniels, running back at Texas A&M. This is really kind of playing on the fact that, again, Le'Veon Moss went down against South Carolina. It did not look good. And Daniels is really all they have left in that backfield. Yeah, they got E.J. Smith back there, but let's be real. Like, Daniels is clearly the better back. And even without like a full workhorse volume here, like, Daniels has been pretty solid against LSU. 12 carries, 91 yards. Against South Carolina, 13 carries, 83 yards and a touchdown there. We haven't seen what Daniels looks like as the lead back in a positive game script for him, where he can run the ball. Like, Aggies are not having to throw to catch up or anything like that. So I think Daniels could be an interesting play. He's on bye this week, but then he comes back the week after with a matchup against New Mexico State. That could be absolutely awesome. And then you get at Auburn the week after that. That's probably about a 50-50 shot on like how good of a matchup that is. We'll probably have some better news in terms of what's going on with Le'Veon Moss by that point. So at the very least, grab Daniels a week ahead of time. That way you can play him against New Mexico State there in week 12. That is, yes, week 12. And then Floyd Chalk, another guy that we kind of mentioned on the show before, rostered in 25% of leagues. He's going up against Oregon State this weekend. Oregon State is bottom 2 in the country when it comes to defensive rushing team performance there. So, yes, he doesn't really get the volume. He's had 10, 12, and 10 carries, but he's been pretty efficient with those carries. 6.1 yards, 7.6 yards, and 8.9 yards per carry in each of those games, respectively. You hope he falls into the end zone, and that can get you a pretty nice day out of him. I think he should be able to run buck wild over Oregon State. And then I'm also throwing in Elijah Gillum, another guy here that with Malik Sherrod down. He's the clear number 1 back. A little bit of a weird game this past week, only getting 10 carries versus Hawaii, but they were able to just shut him down pretty well. And so I don't expect that to happen again this week against Air Force, though. Air Force is a surprisingly kind of pretty porous defense for a triple option team. Usually you're kind of looking at them saying like, oh, this is, pretty, like they run the ball. So, or they run the ball, control the clock and everything. That's usually paired with a pretty successful defense. Not this year for Air Force. And then he's not on the screen, but I'll throw out Elijah Young here out of West Kentucky. Again, you're looking at him getting around 15 to 25 carries in each of his last 4 games. They're going to be against New Mexico State. They're very susceptible versus the run. I think that you could have some fun there. With that being said, a sip of water, and then we'll touch on wide receivers, and then we'll be done for the day. I realize I'm talking way too much about some of these guys because we're already over an hour into this show. My apologies, y'all. I think we can get through these receivers pretty quickly, though. Let's talk about my number 1 guy for this week. This is a guy that I think is going to fly under a lot of people's radars because he hasn't had any monster games, but he is filling in a role that is especially important in a PPR setting, right? That's Ryan Davis, wide receiver out of New Mexico, rostered on 3% of leagues. If you listen to the shows early on in the season, you know that I was a big fan of Luke Wysong. I talked about the fact that Bronco Mendenhall is good for at least one 100 target wide receiver every single year, and Wysong was clearly that guy to start the season. He was getting targeted a ton. Wasn't finding the end zone a lot, which was kind of weird. But regardless, if you're in a PPR league, he was absolute gold. And unfortunately, now Wysong is down, and ever since then, there's been no training period from there, right? Ryan Davis immediately stepped into that role. 9 catches, 146 yards against Colorado State 2 weeks ago. And then this past week, 13 targets, 6 catches, 74 yards, and a touchdown versus Wyoming. So you're talking about a guy that's gotten 13 plus targets, each of his last 2 games, clearly cause and effect from Wysong going down. They needed a new favorite target. Davis is that guy. And the best part about Davis is that he might end up being more valuable than Wysong was, because Davis actually can find the end zone. I don't know what it is about Wysong. They just can't seem to find a end zone shot for him to save his life. But Davis can absolutely be that guy that could maybe hit an even higher total than what we were seeing with Wysong, just because of his ability to score. Just like before, again, I like the upcoming matchups here for New Mexico. Again, San Diego State this weekend's pretty solid against the pass, but I think that, just with the sheer volume that Davis is getting, he should be more than fine. And then against Washington State, I fully expect for New Mexico to be playing from behind in both of these games. So again, the volume will be there for Davis really no matter what. I don't care what kind of ranking both of these teams have, defending the pass. I think no matter what, just the game script's going to help Davis. So next up is a guy that I know for a fact we talked about on the show 2 weeks ago. I think Nate might have even said him again last week. Well, I'm going to mention him a third time just because, again, he had a monster performance this past week. But Eric Rivers, the wide receiver at FIU, rostered on 28% of leagues. This is pretty much your last chance to go grab him if he's available in any of your leagues. Again, almost 300 yards this past week, 3 touchdowns. Obviously, I don't expect that to happen again, but he has a bye this week, and then we go into the playoffs after that with Jacksonville State and Kennesaw State. Those are 2 teams that Eric Rivers could absolutely do well against there. Again, as I mentioned before, really before his monster week this past week, he was very, very consistent against scoring pretty much between 90 and 100 yards 3 weeks straight, a touchdown basically being a coin flip. Well, he's become a touchdown monster for this Florida International team that I don't even think is really that good of an offense, but they're clearly learning to ride through Rivers here. So I think that, what else is there really to say? Again, just look at his performances from this past week. Look at what he was doing before that point. I think he's here to stay, and I think this end of season schedule is going to be absolutely advantageous for him. So that's all I got to say on Eric Rivers. Go grab him. Jordan Napier, wide receiver out of San Diego State, is another one that's another kind of late bloomer here. As the season kind of rolls around, a redshirt freshman here, rostered on 1% of leagues. This past week, 11 targets, 8 catches, 79 yards, and a touchdown against Boise State. This Sean Lewis system slowly but surely kind of coming together here, and Napier's been a guy that's really kind of come along over the last couple of weeks. Against Wyoming, 6 targets, 4 catches, 41 yards, and a touchdown. A little bit worse against Washington State. Again, 4 catches, 3 targets, 44 yards. But with kind of Lewis Brown kind of fading a little bit as the season kind of closes here, obviously Lewis Brown was dealing with a suspension as well. Napier clearly is becoming one of Danny O'Neill's favorite targets. And I mentioned before that, Hawaii had New Mexico and Utah State as part of their end of season schedule. Well, guess what? So does San Diego State. They get New Mexico this weekend, which obviously should be absolutely fantastic for points there. They get UNLV afterwards. I'm a little worried about UNLV. Again, they're 38th in the country when it comes to defensive passing team performance there. And then they get Utah State the week after, right? Like that, the New Mexico and Utah State, just having those 2 matchups in 2 of your next 3 weeks for any of your players is going to be absolutely massive for you. So I like Napier moving forward. Again, his targets are a little bit inconsistent, but given the fact that his role in his offense is growing a little bit, Lewis Brown's fading a little bit, I'm willing to take the shot and just hope that those matchups where you're going up against New Mexico, Utah State, both of those turn into absolute shootouts. And, Napier's been a touchdown magnet for the Aztecs this year. So I bet that continues in those matchups. All right, moving on to my next wide receiver. For those of you on the podcast, I just threw up some air quotes with my hands there. Kelly Joyner, wide receiver / running back out of South Florida. This past week, 11 rushing attempts for 81 yards and a touchdown. He also had 2 catches for 32 yards and a touchdown. Let's be real. He plays mostly running back for this team, but ever since Byron Browns not ever since. It took a week or 2 to kind of get this going, but Joyner's become a massive part of getting this South Florida offense really back on track, right? Because without Byron Brown, this offense looked lost for a week or two there. And now Joyner's become an absolute catalyst, right? Again, against UAB, where South Florida was down pretty big in that game pretty early on. Joyner became a revelation. 15 carries, 94 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He also had 2 catches for 34 yards and a touchdown. I already mentioned his stat line from this past week. So all in all, you've seen him get 26 carries for almost 200 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns. And then, 64 yards or 66 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air over the last 2 weeks. He's just become an all-around weapon for South Florida. He is a guy that this offense runs through now. They need him to make plays, and or if they're going to get anywhere where they want to go. And his upcoming schedule is fantastic here with South Florida. You get Navy this upcoming week, who's susceptible very much versus the run. They're 88th in the country. And then after that, you get Charlotte, who's just a terrible all-around defense. I think Kelly Joyner is absolutely going to feast there as well. He should be pretty efficient. Then you get Tulsa. Tulsa's average versus the run, so I'm a little worried there. But again, they're susceptible versus the pass, so that'll help kind of open things up for Joyner. Joyner just all around is clearly one of the better players for the South Florida offense. He's got a nice schedule here to finish out AAC play. And so given the fact, again, if you're in a PPR league, I think this is a must-have. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see more 20-plus performances out of Joyner as we kind of close out this season here, especially if they are going to continue to rely on him as a catalyst for this offense. So with that being said, we got one last wide receiver that are going to really dive into here, and that is Cameron Shanks, the wide receiver out of UAB, rostered on 5% of leagues. A lot of people have, rightfully so, kind of zeroed in on Amari Thomas and his revelation ever since the quarterback change was made there at UAB. But a guy that kind of has flown under the radar just a little bit is Cameron Shanks. I mean, clearly by his 5% rostership on Fantrax. And he's, if not doing, I'd have to see, I mean, Thomas has been fantastic the last couple of weeks, but I'd have to see how close Shanks has actually been in terms of total pointage over the last couple of weeks. I think it's closer than people realize. Yes, Thomas has benefited greatly from the quarterback change, but so is Shanks. They're just force feeding both Thomas and Shanks. They're a clear dynamic duo at wide receiver for the Blazers here. I mean, Shanks had 11 plus targets in 2 of his last 3 games. And then this past week, he only had 7 targets, but he didn't need more than that to finish with over 150 yards and 3 touchdowns. That doesn't even include the punt return touchdown that Shanks was able to pull off in this game as well. So if you missed out on Amari Thomas, grabbing him off the waiver wire, you got a second chance here with Shanks. And I think Shanks might even be a potentially more explosive option than Amari Thomas. Amari Thomas lives and dies by his volume, but Shanks is a guy that, like I said, this past week, he had 4 less targets than he did the previous 2 weeks, and he actually ended up with more yardage because he's just that dang explosive a lot of times. He's got some great matchups here. Again, UConn, Memphis, Rice. Nothing that'll really blow your doors off in terms of being oh my God, I have to play him against that. But those are all teams that UAB, at least this new version of the UAB offense that seems to kind of turn it around a little bit this part of the season. I think Shanks will be a pretty important player for them moving forward, and I think he'll be able to take advantage of the likes of UConn, Memphis, and Rice. So I like Shanks moving forward. I think he'll be pretty solid. Let's move on to some wide receiver honorable mentions here that we've kind of talked about before. Again, Jordan Tyson, wide receiver at Arizona State, clear number 1 target for Sam Levin moving forward. He just came off another 81-yard and touchdown performance there. 14 targets this past week. Matt Sykes, the wide receiver out of Rice, he's going up against Memphis this week. He just came off with another one of his signature games here. The game against UConn was very much a fluke. Otherwise, he's been very consistent. 8 receptions, 93 yards, and a touchdown this past week. He's got Memphis and UAB on slate here. I think that he'll continue to just kind of put up, not game-breaking stats, but if you're in a PPR league or, you're just looking for a high floor guy, I think Sykes is your guy. Caleb Douglas, wide receiver out of Texas Tech, is another one to really take a look at here. before this past week was a little weird. Only 6 targets, 5 catches, 35 yards. But before that point, Douglas has been on fire, clear favorite of Baron Morton and Will Hammond both. Again, 10 plus targets in 3 of his last 4 games, 99 plus yards in in 3 of his last 4 games, 3 touchdowns in the game against Baylor. Obviously, you'd like to probably see those touchdowns spread out a little bit. But if last week against Iowa State was a fluke, and I can almost guarantee you it was because Iowa State's defense is pretty solid, I think that if Douglas can get back on track versus Colorado this week, he's absolutely worth grabbing off the waiver wire. Then you get Oklahoma State the week after that. Actually, no, never mind. You get a bye after that. Then you get Oklahoma State in the middle of your playoffs there. I think Douglas could be pretty solid for you. This weekend, Washington State plays Utah State. I've talked about Utah State just being one of those matchups you got to take advantage of. And I'm going to do it again here with a wide receiver with Chris Hudson going up against Utah State this weekend. Before this past weekend, not this past weekend, but the weekend before, where Hudson only had 5 targets, Hudson was locked into 10 targets for 4 straight games. Now, the production didn't always come with that, and he only had 2 touchdowns in that 4-game stretch, one of which came on an end around. So I'm a little worried about that, but this matchup against Utah State this weekend, like, Wazoo should be able to name the score against the Aggies this weekend. Hudson should be able to bounce back from his performance against San Diego State here, and I think he'll be in line for a pretty solid game here. And then last but not least, I already talked about UCF a little bit with their change in quarterback to Dylan Risk. And one guy that has absolutely benefited from this change is Jacoby Jones, the Ohio transfer wide receiver there at UCF. Not incredible volume. Again, 5 targets this past week, but 5 catches, 106 yards, and a touchdown. The week before that, he was able to get targeted 8 times for 6 catches, 116 yards, and a touchdown. So 200-yard performances and a touchdown in a row there for Jacoby Jones. Clearly has some really nice chemistry with Dylan Risk here. You get Arizona State, who's a pretty decent defense, get a bye, and then you get West Virginia, who is atrocious versus the pass. That could be a really sneaky play there during semifinals, especially if you kind of get caught caught red-handed with some of those Week 13 buys, like Hawaii, Memphis, Oregon, teams like that, right? And you need to plug in a guy. I think Jones could be a pretty interesting play there. With that being said, nope, I have one more thing. I almost forgot our DSCs. No tight end plays this week. Again, there's just not really anything out there. Again, if you want me to name names, again, Taylor Thompson's still available in about 3/4 of leagues right now. Joshua Simon has been solid for South Carolina recently, but really outside of those guys, I don't think I really love any tight ends out there that are rostered under 30%. But DSCs real quick, we'll kind of run through this. Got 3 of them for you guys this week. I don't love any of them, but BYU, they're going up against Utah. Something's up with Utah. They're just straight broken right now. I don't know what's going on with that program. There's some internal things going on, but this was a team that was picked to not only win the Big 12, but potentially dominate the Big 12, and here they are losing to Houston at this point in the season. Something's up there. BYU, undefeated. They smell blood. They're going to want to take care of their rival. I think BYU potentially body bags Utah this upcoming weekend. So I'm picking their DST. Fresno State is going up against Air Force. Air Force is another one of these teams that has struggled mightily on offense this year, just surprisingly all around. Fresno State's defense is pretty solid, so I'm just going to take them, and I'm going to play them against an offense that struggles. That's kind of the winning formula here a lot of times for DST plays. And last one, I'll be real, I kind of threw this one in because I felt like I had to put at least three teams to give you guys. But Western Kentucky, they're going up against New Mexico State. New Mexico State's offense has been atrocious this year. West Kentucky's defense has actually been relatively solid for the most part this year. Again, if you look at their DST points, you're not really seeing anything lower than 15. You're not really seeing anything greater than 22, but I think that safe floor is definitely a lot better than trying to rely on some of these DSTs that, there's a potential that you could completely bottom out. Like I did last week when I played Texas A&M against South Carolina. Boy, that sucked. yeah, all that being said, appreciate all of you guys. Thank you for bearing with me. I've been a little bit rambly tonight, so hopefully that didn't turn off too many of you guys. But we are going to finish at just under an hour and a half here. But appreciate you guys bearing with me again last week as I was getting over my food poisoning there. Appreciate you guys bearing with me as I kind of get back in the groove here with this waiver wire show. And yeah, like I said, appreciate all of you guys for listening. If you guys have not already, make sure you leave that comment, leave the likes, leave the subscribes. If you're on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show, leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Make sure you check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. We'll see you guys back here on Wednesday, where I will be going over week 11 and talking to you guys about some sit and starts for this so crucial week as you get prepared for your playoffs. Until then, really appreciate you guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.